Good evening and welcome to the countries Iraq, represented by Anu,
Hello.
and the United Kingdom, represented by Edom,
Hi.
to the International Conference regarding terrorism. This meeting has been initiated by some university students to explore the impacts of advocacy and activism on terrorism in your nations, while also discussing how possible changes to activism and advocacy can have a positive impact on your respective nations. Terrorism is often perceived by many to mean Islamic extremism. However, despite the increased conversation surrounding terrorism, the occurrence of such existed long before the 9/11 attacks and has been perpetuated by a variety of different groups, including a variety of people from animal rights groups, conservative Christians, and those on both the radical left and right side of politics. Terrorism is defined in the Oxford Dictionary as the unlawful use of violence and intimidation, especially against civilians, in the pursuit of political aims. Terrorism can destabilize governments, undermine civil society, jeopardize peace, security, and threaten social and economic development. Currently, there are no international consensus on the agreed definition of terrorism, as it is notoriously difficult to term, and due to government fear that they may incriminate themselves through doing such. While the reality and repercussions of terrorism are experienced in all regions across the globe, there are nuances in the realities of those experiences, and they also differ vastly, and responses differ vastly from various government officials and advocates from within a region. The 9/11 attacks were the catalyst that caused an international outcry of fear and questioning as to how such a horrific attack on US soil had been possible. After the 9/11 attacks, there was an increased effort to create a comprehensive convention on international terrorism. This proposed treaty aims to criminalize terrorism in all forms while also criminalizing terrorists and those who have provided funds to such. The increase in terrorism can result in somewhat of a global panic, which is then exploited by those in government to create a state of emergency and create emergency measures which infringe upon human rights, with a war on terror becoming the justification for the invasion of privacy. Legal activists have been using a variety of platforms, including social media, to make the public aware of government behaviours and policies, advocating for basic human rights to be upheld and the importance of government transparency in the face of terrorist threats. The recent years following the 9/11 attacks and the London bombings of 2005 have led to an increase in xenophobia and Islamophobia due to misdirected anger, fear, and grief in the global community. 9/11 has created much legal change surrounding airport law and immigration law, as many citizens believe there to be a needed tougher and more rigorous analysis of those who are being allowed in their nations. These policies came about through the advocacy of both government and the general population expressing concerns. I would like to invite Anu to express why the theme of terrorism is important and the impact of increased terrorism in a Muslim majority country.
Thank you, Hannah. I want to start off by thanking both the United Nations and the different universities that have come together to make this event possible. The topic of terrorism raises several grey areas of ambiguity, and targeted countries such as Iraq merely get the opportunity to state our opinion and offer our diverse perspective. Before understanding the importance of an issue, I believe it's significant we understand the proper definition of what it is and what the common misconceptions about terrorism are. As Hannah previously said, we noticed that definition of terrorism doesn't single out any religious group or particular country, but is a universal definition. Society has formed a false narrative on what terrorism is and who both provokes it and is affected by it. This is a major implication in the Middle East and Muslim-dominated countries such as Iraq, who are negatively associated with terror. So the major importance of this theme is to properly understand terrorism and give insight to the young generation about any false fictions about the topic. Sher Khan's study on the effects and misconceptions on terrorism provides an accurate indication and accurate description of false narratives. This is prominent to our discussion as a lot of these misconceptions directly influence how the world perceives Iraq. The first misconception is that Takfir terrorism makes up a majority of the attacks. This shows terrorism in the West is not exclusively limited to the Al-Qaeda domain. In the United States, 94% of terrorist attacks from the period of 1980 to 2005 were committed by a perpetrator that did not have any Islamic background. Similarly, from 2011, 7% of these attacks had a religious conviction. Secondly, the size of the fatal consequence of terrorism in the non-Western world, terrorist incidents in the global South did not receive the same exposure of those in the West. Articles dedicated to the terrorist attack in Baghdad were grossly underreported compared to such from from Paris. This is also evident with the Middle East and Africa having 50 times more deaths of terrorism than Europe or the Americas combined. Moving on, the threat of terror has drastic effects on Muslim people's ability to travel. Being an Iraqi man, I have been subject to struggles of prejudice in our society. Since the fatal impact of 9/11, it seems that a burqa or the presence of a bearded Arab male is an automatic stop sign to authorities. Schedule 7 of Terrorism Act of 2000 are having some significant negative impacts across Muslim communities. This occurs as they have the power to question any person for up to 9 hours. This results in an abundance of racial and religious profiling, as individuals have reported being asked how many times a day they pray, the names of mosques they attend, their understanding of the term jihad, and their knowledge of the Muslim community groups and organizations. So overall, the main importance would be to raise the awareness and educate the population on what is fact and what is fiction about terrorism. Thank you, Hannah.
Thank you, Anu. I would like to invite Eden to discuss the importance of upholding human rights for all citizens, including those in her country, and protecting other members of society from terrorism.
Thanks, Hannah. I'd just like to say it's a real privilege to be a part of this discussion today. I think it's important that the Universal Declaration of Human Rights is always upheld, and that when it's not and there is human rights abuse, that we continue to advocate for change because of the detrimental impact that human rights abuse has. Human rights activist groups such as Amnesty International have worked hard for decades to fight against human rights abuse, such as opposing the US military's use of violence in Abu Ghraib post 9/11. I think also the issue of terrorism has become more complex and difficult for activists and advocates to overcome, but their efforts have been central and crucial in the movement towards peace. The impacts of conflict which has affected my country, the UK, such as the conflict with Ireland in the 20th century, although the violence stopped and the conflict ceased due to the Good Friday Peace Agreement, which was signed in 1998, which was political, the work that the non-government organisations and the community and voluntary groups did throughout the 1990s was instrumental in that agreement being signed, and the conflict was stopped through the cross-community networking and reconciliation work that they did prior. I think as well, a rising issue that we've seen in the UK as well from counter-terrorism laws is discrimination and racist attitudes within society, particularly with the issue of Islamophobia, and we need continued advocacy surrounding terrorism. I think overall it highlights that we need advocacy and activism to continue to break stigma and discrimination caused by counter-terrorism laws. Advocacy and activism are fantastic tools that can be used to promote global safety and resolve conflict peacefully to keep our human rights upheld. Thanks, Hannah.
Thank you, Eden. It is a highly controversial topic as to how governments and officials should respond to terrorism while also respecting one's basic human rights and the rule of law. We have seen many human rights advocates attempting to shape government policy and influence public attitudes so that those accused are still treated with respect and dignity. Due to the fear of terrorism creates through a population, government often utilize this fear in order to provide legal justifications for the policies that clearly infringe upon an individual's human rights through various dubious and harmful policies. The law in times of fear is often vulnerable to manipulation as people begin ignorance and sacrificing their own human rights to supposedly improve safety within a nation. Legal norms can be manipulated, so society is believed to be in a constant state of emergency in order to justify these radical features. Human rights advocates push back against human rights abuses, including everything to torture from the invasion of privacy. As civil liberties are reduced in nations across Europe and throughout North America, these human rights issues have been exacerbated, and the continual ignorance and tolerance of the general population, with many citizens failing to realise the true repercussions of these government policies and decisions. For instance, in August 2014, it was reported that law enforcement agencies had been accessing Australians' web browsing histories without a warrant through telecommunications companies such as Telstra. It has also been reported that Australia issued 75% more wiretap warrants than the US in 2003, on a 26 times greater amount than the US on a per capita basis. The global war on terror has had a largely detrimental effect on human rights, with certain rights of the population sacrificed in the name of protection and the need for intelligence, while the treatment of prisoners and those accused of terrorist or extremist offences are being largely ignored. However, when governments respond to this through various measures that infringe upon the citizens' privacy, there was significant backlash with an increased number of individuals wanting to protect their privacy, with many legal activists beginning to advocate for the rights of both the general population and of the accused. However, doing so is a challenging task. Other known organisations, such as Human Rights Watch, have done little to speak out against the human rights violations of the general population during the war on terror. Other NGOs, such as the United Nations, are currently advocating primarily for the victims affected and those accused, focusing on international treaties which ban the use of torture. However, little has been done to advocate for the unjust domestic government policies which infringe upon one's right to privacy. This has resulted in the introduction of NGOs whose primary motive is to protect human rights and the digital privacy of individuals around the world, and this is something that has come about due to the change in government policies as a result of terrorism, with organisations such as Access Now, which was founded in 2009, currently having offices all throughout Europe, Asia, and the Americas. There are also more specialist organisations such as the Australian Privacy Foundation, which is based in the single country. While other individual activists are trying to influence, namely the public, magistrates, and other decision makers, and prompting various other international organisations to create political change. I'd now like to invite Eden to respond and discuss why legal activism and advocacy is important and other changes regarding NGOs.
Thanks, Hannah. I think particularly post 9/11 and the reforms we've seen in counter-terrorism laws, we've seen legal activism and advocacy in this area become increasingly important. I've looked into research surrounding communities in the United States and how they worked using advocacy to rebuild their community after the September 11 attack, where one community worked to promote the inclusion of Muslim American people into civic institutions, community activist groups, and how they could work to involve them in a deeper political engagement. And they use this with the aim to create long-term change by combating hate crimes, building understanding, and raising awareness. I think a key part of legal activism and advocacy surrounding this area must involve trying to correct the discrimination that counter-terror laws have caused. I researched a study conducted in my country at the University of Manchester from 2016 to 2017. They used 27 participants who were involved in a youth justice advocacy group, and they were primarily British Muslims. And they looked at the link between counter-terror laws and the rise in Islamophobia, and they found there had been a creation of almost a suspect community and misrecognition, leading to the majority participants not feeling able to speak up. With non-government organisations, they have been very significant in this area. They've focused on identifying national human rights standards, which has allowed them to reform security issues in the 1990s, such as landmines and debt relief. We've seen an increased role in NGOs and the advantages that they can have working on the ground. They've been able to hold governments accountable for counter-terror laws and if they infringe on human rights. And this has enabled them to have a role in human governance. They've had key roles in supporting peace, but can also perform the role of an educator, as we see this role becoming increasingly useful as they can be used in both counter-terrorism and terrorism to create change. Thanks, Hannah.
Thank you, Eden. There has been a variety of different forms of advocacy and activism by both organisations, individuals, and wider community groups attempting to promote legal change regarding the issue of terrorism and its effects on society, with some individuals advocating for stricter immigration laws, more rigorous screening, and greater monitoring of the general population to prevent homegrown terrorist attacks. Alternatively, upon harsher legislation for terrorist offences and new laws which infringe upon our human rights, there has been significant backlash, with individuals and organisations advocating for fairer treatment and more humane treatment for those accused, including those in maximum security prisons such as Guantanamo Bay. Although there is currently a universal ban on torture, which has been proven as an ineffective way of interrogations, however, despite this, the use of torture is being overlooked in the case of prisoners in Guantanamo Bay, where the current US president stating he would even order waterboarding in a heartbeat, and a hell of a lot worse than waterboarding, only because a stupid person would say it didn't work. And that is a direct quote. This clearly displays the abuse of power and how horrific nature of torture and human rights abuses can be overlooked in the name of counterterrorism. Throughout Trump's election, there has been significant use of slacktivism, such as use of the media, online petitions, and social media to advocate against his position as president and the offensive remarks made, including horrific comments about the use of torture and those who are suspected of terrorist offences. I would like to invite Anu to respond to the remarks made and discuss the use of torture and prejudice.
Thank you, Hannah. Donald Trump has shown us over the years his focus is more on the prosperity of the United States rather than having a peaceful world. I also believe the president doesn't understand the magnitude of his comments and the lasting implications it can have on communities. Waterboarding is around as one of the most worst forms of torture dating back to the Spanish Inquisition. The use of torture in general is consistently known to produce false confessions and unreliable and misleading information. This occurs as people are faced with imminent, excruciating pain, where a victim will simply say anything. More importantly, the use of torture is not morally acceptable. Cruel, inhumane, or degrading treatment or punishment prohibits treaty law, such as the Convention of Torture, and an individual's human rights as a whole. My major issue is that the Guantanamo Bay detention camp targets Muslim militants and suspected terrorists, focusing on countries such as Afghanistan and Iraq. So honestly speaking, I was extremely hurt by the president's comments, as I believe he didn't take into account these issues and how Muslim countries such as Iraq can be unfairly targeted. But I'm eager to see the UK's response. Thank you, Hannah.
Thank you, Anu. I'd like to invite Eden to respond regarding changes to activism and advocacy.
Thanks, Hannah. We've seen transnational advocacy play a central role in spreading awareness around human rights abuse around the world, such as torture, as organisations can use the Universal Declaration to pinpoint exactly where abuse is occurring. In terms of the future, it's been argued that human rights activism lacks ties to local activism, and its focus on shaming and exposure due to the campaign nature rather than prevention creates a gap between local activists, which creates a disconnect from the issues of human rights abuse. Education needs to be used to close the gap, to eliminate the conditions that lead to abuse, such as systemic inequalities, so that we can continue to fight for change against human rights abuse while addressing underlying systemic causes of human rights violations. The UN declared it was the decade for human rights education in 1995. And human rights education is a model that looks like it targets everyone despite their societal background or economic development, and it uses the Universal Declaration of Human Rights as a basis to give information about human rights standards and raises awareness of what distinguishes human rights from values and the importance of law, constitutions, and how it's in everyone's best interest to live in a world where we all have our human rights upheld always. It also teaches history about what happens when our human rights aren't upheld or encroached, and what impact does this have, and why do we have treaties to protect us from this. And then it also goes on to do some emotional teaching of injustice and abuse and what action is taken to promote human rights regardless of the law or conflict. And what do we know is the common good? And this is a good way to get rid of discriminatory attitudes. And then the final level is the third and active level, and it teaches skills to effectively prevent and fight against human rights violations. So lobbying, political participation and communication skills, and peaceful protesting that removes the shaming aspect away from the campaigning. Thanks, Hannah.
Thank you very much, Eden. I would now like to invite Anu to discuss why it is important for university students to be aware of the issue of terrorism.
Thank you, Hannah. There has been a spiraling improvement on what is taught in universities all around the world about terrorism and its renowned repercussions. Western countries are beginning to incorporate the voices of minority groups that are directly influenced by prejudice regarding the issue. Through strenuous efforts from jihadi groups like the Council on Islamic Education and their offshoot support from other brotherhood organizations, they control the narrative about Islam in universities. The main message from this is to distinguish the gap between terrorism and religion and present Islam as peaceful. The main aim for universities is to eliminate ignorance in the field of terrorism, which can help with counterterrorism in a globalized world. Universities throughout the world also provide studies on global security to target terrorism and counterterrorism. Some of these positive outcomes include analyzing and clearly evaluate the different and competing approaches to global security, clearly evaluating strategies to enhance or enable global security, clearly and accurately communicate with complex information, concepts, and problems with respect to global security, demonstrate and well-developed interpersonal skills and ethical practice in collaboration with people from diverse backgrounds, trying to eliminate prejudice in that context. These studies will have a rewarding impact in battling Islamophobia present in society today. Islamophobia is still denied and downplayed in wider circles. This is evident with 79.6% of Muslim women having been targeted in Australia when wearing the hijab. This is rooted in the misconception and lack of education of the truth of terrorism and where it all spawns from. All in all, teaching in terrorism in universities will help to provide a safer society. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Anu. I'd like to thank both the countries of Iraq and the United Kingdom for participating in this meeting.